Tom's work is widely acclaimed. He shared the 2008 Prime Minister's History Prize with the book from his Antarctic Fellowship, Slicing the Ice, Voyaging to Antarctica. Sorry, Slicing the Silence, Voyaging to Antarctica. Slicing the Ice was something different. Slicing the Silence had previously won the Douglas Stewart Prize for Non-Fiction at the 2008 New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards, the 2007 Queensland Premier's Literary Award for Non-Fiction, and it had been shortlisted for the 2007 The Age Book of the Year. For earlier works, Tom has also received the Victorian Premier's Literary Prize for Non-Fiction, a Eureka Prize, the Ernest Scott Prize, and a 1996 New South Wales Book of the Year Award. In 2003, Tom received a Centenary Medal for, quote, services to Australian history and culture. And in 2000, he was elected as a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities. Not so far away from Antarctica, Tom won the 2009 Alfred Deakin Prize for his essay, We Have Still Not Lived Long Enough, which I read and thought was beautifully written. In another case of symmetry, he shared his 2008 Prime Minister's History Award with Robert Kenny, who had lost his home in the February bushfires, and the essay, We Have Still Not Lived Long Enough, was about those very fires. Not afraid to be lyrical, Tom's writing is both accessible and enlightening, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce him this evening. Tom.
Thank you very much, Tony, for that very kind introduction, and it's an honour to be chaired by you. I greatly appreciated your support as Director of the Antarctic Division whilst I was writing my book. I also want to thank the University of Tasmania for inviting me here, particularly Pam Sharp and Marcus Howard. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you all for coming. And there's a story that I am beholden to begin with in this place. It's one that many of you, I think, already know. Speaking here in Hadley's Hotel, I have to pay my respects to its most famous Antarctic association. In December 1911, the great Norwegian explorer, Roald Amundsen, successfully reached the South Pole. He arrived there a month before the British explorer, Robert Falcon Scott. By the end of January, Amundsen had returned to his ship, the famous Fram, and now, having won the race to the pole, he also had to win the race back to civilisation to break the news. It was an anxious voyage. Amundsen had beaten Scott to the pole, but would he beat the Terra Nova back to port? After a 5-week struggle north across the Southern Ocean, he sighted the Tasmanian coastline on the 4th of March. But then he missed the entrance into Storm Bay, and it still took days to get into Hobart, fighting against a series of storms. Finally, on the 7th of March 1912, the conqueror of the South Pole anchored his ship off Hobart and came ashore alone with the harbour master. It had been a long, dry summer in Tasmania, and the evidence of drought was everywhere. But these Antarctic refugees delighted in the slightest sign of green, however faded. Once ashore, Amundsen sent his coded and cablegrams to the King of Norway, to Fridtjof Nansen, to the world. His telegram simply said, "Pole attained 14th, 17th December 1911, all well." In a day or two, it was on the front page of all the newspapers. The New York Times declared that the whole world has now been discovered. On the same day that Amundsen sent his telegram, Robert Scott and his companions were still on the Ross Ice Barrier fighting for their lives. In a few days, Captain Oates would walk outside to his death, and in 2 weeks the survivors would write their last letters from their final lonely camp near 80 degrees south. Those remarkable letters that are like the holy scripts of Antarctic civilisation. But the world would not learn of this tragedy for almost another year. In Hobart, on the 7th of March 1912, Amundsen was trying to lie low until his telegrams were sent and his news was officially announced. His ship remained offshore, refusing communication. Spectators at the wharf were shunned, journalists frustrated. The explorer himself, although he had what he called a burning eagerness to announce his news, he was secretive, and he refused to tell anything of his South Pole adventures. He'd just got off a tiny ship that had been to the end of the earth and back. He was looking forward to some of the civilised comforts of the temperate world. Although they'd smartened themselves up a bit in Storm Bay, Amundsen still looked a bit scruffy and unwashed. He was wearing his peaked cap and blue sweater. He came ashore and booked, of course, in here at Hadley's. Treated as a tramp, he noted in his diary, given a miserable little room. Here he was in a former British colony, proud, defensive, secretive, and perhaps a little too ready to feel jilted. When Roald Amundsen beat Robert Falcon Scott to the South Pole in 1911, he left him a gift to find should he too arrive there. The gift was his sextant. Perhaps he chose this object because it was the most potent symbol of his triumph over latitude. I think the most unexamined and astonishing fact about the race to the South Pole in 1911-12 is that the two sledging parties located the same featureless acre of ice on that vast continent. Reaching the North Pole or the South Pole was and still is the most abstract of goals, 90 degrees. Scott had a gift for Amundsen too, an unwilling gift, a tragic gift. Scott's arrival at the same spot on that endless ice, and his journal accounts of the misery of discovering the Norwegian tent with its gift of a sextant, and the miraculous discovery of those diaries under his head when he and his companions were found dead in their tent later that year, this grim written evidence was to make Amundsen's triumph indisputable. The attainment of the North Pole a few years earlier was, and still is, subject to endless doubt and controversy. But at the South Pole, Scott's navigation and documentation corroborated Amundsen's achievement. It's appropriate, I think, to begin with this story, not only because we meet here in wonderful Hadley's, but also because a lecture on the intriguing history of Antarctic civilisation should begin with a tale from the heroic era of Antarctic exploration. The heroic era, as you know, describes the 2 decades from the final years of the 19th century to World War I, when Antarctica became the focus of intense, private and patriotic endeavour. The age was heroic because it generated tales of extraordinary individual achievement and sacrifice. But it was also heroic because the explorers aimed not so much to secure territory as to achieve geographical goals and to establish national pride on the world stage. As we struggle with the question of what constitutes Antarctic civilisation, we might fittingly begin with this legendary era. Amundsen, Scott, Shackleton, Mawson and others of those years established the metaphors of language and experience on the ice. We cannot help but see Antarctica partly through their eyes and their experiences. Modern expeditioners sometimes dream of Edwardian figures sledging on the ice, and that unremitting Antarctic wind is, as one put it, the wind of Scott's death. Scott's final tent and Amundsen's South Pole tent are both now embedded in the ice sheet, travelling slowly, inexorably towards its edge. They are part of the archaeology of Antarctica, part of the prehistory of its civilisation. Those two words that I've thrown together in my title, Antarctic civilisation, might provoke us by their proximity. Antarctica is a place where nature is lethal, where humans are always just visitors and the land is covered by ice kilometres deep. It's a landscape in which the laws of chemistry and physics, and indeed the power of metaphysics, predominate, and terrestrial biology looks very marginal indeed. The ocean is where the life is. The largest land animal is a mite. The ice is massive, deadly, and in spite of its own variety, reductionist. It simplifies and universalises. Antarctica is the Earth's only true wilderness, and yet one that is inimical to life. It makes us realise how much of ourselves we unconsciously invest in the concept of wilderness. Biologist David Campbell describes terrestrial Antarctica as the antithesis of the Amazon. It is like the silence between movements of a symphony. At this end of the earth, all students of life, historians included, will be more conscious of the sea than the land and of the wind than the soil. And if terrestrial biology is your interest, then perhaps your most intriguing subject becomes human biology under stress. The physical, mental and social dimensions of living become dangerously seamless in small, isolated communities of people outside nature. The storm in one's soul might well be more destabilising to an expedition than the blizzard outside. When humans visited Antarctica, they're both extremely vulnerable to nature and curiously outside it. On a windless day, they can hear the sound of their own blood coursing through their arteries. They can easily become stranded in their own little ebbing pool of life. Space and time take on new dimensions in Antarctica. The clear polar air is famously elusive, and there are few shadows to provide perspective. Light and looming can reveal features beyond the horizon. A man sledging on the ice could lift his gaze and see the party ahead of him projected as an inverted mirage some distance above their heads. A small part of one's clothing, glimpsed out of the corner of the eye, could appear to be a distant landscape feature. A matchbox could assume the size of a barn. The geologist Lawrence McKinley Gould, always seeking rock amidst the endless ice, once identified a huge exposure of boulders ahead of him on the homeward trail, only to find that it was just dog droppings. Raymond Priestley and his companions found that what appeared to be a dog team travelling towards them on the horizon turned out to be a little scrap of film paper fluttering near the skirting of their tent. A mite might be mistaken for a man. And time too is warped. In Antarctica, it can feel like time has not only skipped a beat, but has lost beat altogether. The extremes of climate and geography and the distortions of high latitudes and compressed longitudes make a weird nonsense of a day. The polar winter, in its sheer generosity of time, recalls for many an early innocence. Writing in the dark of midwinter at Mawson Station in 1959, John Bechervaise tried to evoke the fabric of polar time. He wrote, "Polar time, whose stuff is with me now, great slow halyards of it, passing through an Antarctic night where ordinary time does not exist. Here is always the time of watching, the time of waiting, the time of contemplation, the time of the little child, time that has not been impoverished by being thought valuable." So, in Antarctica, as well as hearing the silence, you can feel the slope of time. Time has contours, it has seasons, and a geography that resists rationalisation. This is a peculiarity of Antarctic culture. The task orientation of peasant societies endures there in surprising company with technology and modernity. The time spirit of the industrial world has struggled to tighten its net around the continent of ice. There are rhythms to the year and to the Antarctic experience. Seeing the ice for the first time is a great adrenaline burst. The sea becomes calmer and one's soul exalts. The ship leaves in late summer and the real adventure begins. Midwinter comes more quickly than you think because you forget that you have not yet reached the thermic depths of the year. There is the excitement and release of the midwinter dinner and pantomime, the mirror moment of the year when you play at opposites, cross-dressing and subverting authority for a day. On Australian stations, as you know, Cinderella is the traditional pantomime. Whether the station leader is cast as Cinderella or an ugly sister may be significant. Midwinter is a moment of celebration because the sun begins its long journey back to you. But the worst is yet to come. The polar winter deepens, the hours seem to move more slowly, night is indistinguishable from day, the blizzards enclose you, the cold enters your bones, there's the weird scintillation of the aurora, and you hear the sighing and sobbing of the ice pack, and the gurglings, blowings and snortings of seals, or was it of something else? Nature, if one could call it that, can be heard but not seen. The inertness of Antarctica begins to claim you. August to October are the danger months. The post-midwinter blues can set in. In late spring, there's the excitement of returning penguins and of quickening summer activities and plans, but also the gnawing anxiety about release. Will the ship come? When will it come? The ship brings the flu and the invasion. There's a famous story that many of you know, I think, of the director of the Australian Antarctic Division, Philip Law, arriving at Macquarie Island in 1950 to relieve a wintering party and finding everyone speaking to one another with theatrical 19th century gentility. The men had survived the winter by repeatedly working through their small film collection, and the group's favourite was Pride and Prejudice. Once they tired of watching it, they turned down the volume and acted out the voices themselves. And you can imagine this ventriloquism easily tipped over into daily relations, and soon men were bowing and holding doors open for one another and addressing their colleagues with sweet and elaborate civility. Such affability, such graciousness, you overwhelm me, they could be heard saying to one another. Well, Antarctic history combines the vastly inanimate and the intensely intimate. You find yourself exposed both to elemental majesty and to social claustrophobia. In Antarctica, it is dangerous to be alone. It's a continent that often draws people who seek solitude only to condemn them to an intense human intimacy. So humans in Antarctica are way outside their biome. They are tiny ecologies of their own, waning heat sources in a vast terrain of ice, condemned always to retreat. Nature is different there, and so is history. Down south, each year begins anew with the breakup of the winter ice. Can history and culture resist that devastating rhythm? How can there be a civilization in a howling wilderness? If a kind of civilization exists, then in what ways might it be distinct or intriguing? In what places or moments would we most aptly find it and define it? Well, perhaps we could begin this quest by looking for it in those huts of the heroic era, in those transported islands of civilization on the edge of the ice, in the fug and glow of their interiors where the blubber stove temporarily kept the cold at bay, when men bunkered down in the long polar winter and prepared industriously for the spring, where meteorological observations were meticulously kept, scientific specimens examined, lectures given, food celebrated, a masculine camaraderie fostered, tensions mostly suppressed, where the Encyclopaedia Britannica settled all disputes, where precious libraries from home fed the mind and the spirit. In those huts, books got blubbery with beloved use. And imagine what book you would choose to take on a sledging journey. You had to make a judgment about its weight, both physical and spiritual. Is it light enough to carry, but heavy enough to sustain you? Will it offer you compressed nourishment like pemmican? Polar expeditions took vast libraries, not only as a source of vital information, but also as a kind of insulation against the elements. On Ernest Shackleton's expedition of a century ago, 1908-09, Professor Edgeworth David would read aloud for hours after supper in the winter hut. Sometimes these midnight readings were only stopped by a firm reminder from Shackleton, called out from his cabin in the corner, that it was after 1 o'clock and time all good explorers were in bed. Books, libraries, journals, letters, notes, literature assumed disproportionate influence in Antarctic history. Words stood out starkly against the snow. Explorers sledged desperately across the ice in the hope of reaching warmth and food and safety, but if they could not save themselves, they aimed to get close enough to be found dead with their diaries. We must wonder, how much greater is the power of the written word at the end of the earth, in an abiotic land with the longest night, a world of black figures on a white background? It's perhaps in these heroic era huts that we today feel closest to a peculiar Antarctic civilisation. Those huts, those remaining, are now shrines. We enter them with a sense of the sacred. Mawson's huts at Commonwealth Bay are amongst our nation's most precious historic buildings and are convincing, tangible evidence of Australia's long investment in Antarctica. The Ross Island huts of Scott and Shackleton remain as tableaux of an Edwardian frontier. In their darkened interiors, you will find still lives with rope, harness, biscuit, wood and tin. You can hear footfalls, voices, whispers, shouting in the night. Decades of accumulated ice were hacked out of the huts and blocks of it were left to melt in the summer sun, leaving a residue of artefacts. It's marvellous what the restoration work turned up. In the hut of Scott's Discovery Expedition were found letters from the 1910s, a script from a play performed in the early 1900s, a plywood snowshoe made from a biscuit case, 10 hand-carved chessmen made possibly from a broom handle, 2 scones found near the blubber stove, and, of course, numerous tins of Huntley and Palmer's biscuits manufactured in 1901. Those biscuits, which sustained many subsequent visitors to the hut and which have been pilfered by many a tourist, are now sacred artefacts of Antarctic history. Let's allow ourselves to be diverted for a moment by this mention of a biscuit. The intriguing history of Antarctic civilisation must say something about food and the culture of the Antarctic dinner table. Antarctic expeditioners, past and present, as I'm sure you know, talk a great deal about food. But early Antarctica was full of men who hadn't cooked much before, working with very limited ingredients. It was not a promising recipe. The privations of exploration and starvation, however, meant that rarely have people celebrated food with such an edge of desperation. Cookbooks for temperate lands, and we see them everywhere in our bookshops these days, cookbooks for temperate lands do not talk about hunger. Unsatisfied hunger brings gravity to the handling of food. Shackleton's and Scott's men, when out sledging, designed a dinner ritual to ensure that there were no grievances about smaller and larger portions. The cook would divide the meal scrupulously, taking every care to make sure the pannikins of hoosh were as equal as possible and the heaps of biscuits too. But even after such attention, perhaps one serving would look bigger, and crumbs could not be divided. When everyone had agreed that the food had been divided fairly, one man would turn his back on the hungry crew. Another would then point to one pannikin or group of biscuits and say, "Whose?" And the man with his back turned would say someone's name. In this way, the food was assigned without rancour, nevertheless ensuring that each person somehow felt that it was they who had drawn the smallest share. But even with the food fairly divided, disaster could strike. In the confines of the tent, eating elbow to elbow, a precious morsel could fall outside the mouth. Apsley Cherry Garrard wrote that, "We have forgotten, or nearly forgotten, how the loss of a biscuit crumb left a sense of injury which lasted for a week." "But if the crumb could be seen," recalled Shackleton, "the others would point it out and the owner would wet his finger in his mouth and pick up the morsel. Not the smallest fragment was allowed to escape." In a culture of such fastidiousness with food, to drop the serving pot, in the words of Priestley, was a catastrophe which ranks in the minds of a sledging party with the fall of empires. Here, ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived at the heart of our subject. We're talking about civilisation, empires, crumbs and serving pots.